All righty, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are here. There may be other people that show up in a few minutes. My name's Carl Binder. I guess I know almost everybody here on the whose name I'm seeing, so that shouldn't be challenging. This we haven't done one of these webinars for a while, and we used to do it in another platform called Webinar Jam, but we're trying Zoom now, and for some reason, the newest version of Zoom, which just downloaded recently, has totally messed up the way it interacts with PowerPoint, at least on my computer. But be that as it may, hopefully you can see the slides. This is a conversation basically that I'm going to have with Cindy Thompson, my colleague. And as the title says, process improvement, ensuring data quality when the risks are high. And what this is about is Cindy is a certified performance thinking practitioner. And the project we're going to talk a little bit about, got my interest in particular because it's about, first of all, as the title says, ensuring data quality. In a situation where that makes a big difference. And it's interesting because Cindy is very detailed in how she approaches this. And one of the challenges is if you've got a process for managing data or for collecting and keeping data, can you figure out what parts of it to intervene in? And so I'll let her talk about that more, but I think the way she approached it was very interesting. And so I wanted to share that with you all. This is kind of the agenda. I'm going to provide a very quick introduction to performance thinking. I can see that everybody on the screen here probably already knows what that is, but this will be very short, just to put you in the context of our two models and the logic we use. Then Cindy will also provide an overview of her project, and then we're going to have a conversation basically, and we'll see where this goes, and we'll try to answer. We'll try to leave some time at the end for conversations, questions, and answers, and so forth with people. Okay, so one of the things before we get into it, this will be on our YouTube channel, and I think most people know about this, but we've got something like 100 videos on this YouTube channel, which you can get to with the URL performancethinking.tv. And so it's a rich resource, and probably by tomorrow or maybe sometime in the weekend, there'll be a recording of this session, and it will be up there. And there's also lots of other stuff as well. As most of you know, performance thinking in our approach to performance is what we call accomplishment based. And this is very much in the lineage of Joe Harless, but Tom Gilbert, his mentor. And so again, as many of you know, this book, Human Competence, which was published in 1978, long time ago. This is one of those books that probably wouldn't be in most libraries because it was published such a long time ago, but it's still being taught in some graduate programs that I know about. And it is, in my view, a sort of a foundational philosophy of performance improvement book. It has probably more ideas than any of us could execute in a lifetime. But the good thing about that is that Joe Harless, who was Gilbert's student, or protege, if you will, turned it into a very practical set of applications, which we're not going to really talk about. But the critical piece, there's really two parts that we took from Tom's many, many ideas. Because I read this book in about 1980, and then I got to meet Tom, and a couple years later, invited him to Boston to do a program, and we got to know each other over the years. And he was a mentor, among others. He was a mentor to many people. But to me, this statement, which I've probably read now 1,000 times to people, is profound. It says, in the great cult of behavior, by which he meant leaders, managers, training and development people, and everybody else, basically, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But then he says, and this is the big deal, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So what he was saying, and as he actually summarized in a little formula that he also had, where he said the worth of an intervention is equal to the value of the accomplishments it enables people to produce, divided by the cost for behavior. What he realized was that what he called accomplishments, the things produced by behavior, is the value. That's what we care about. And that behavior needed to produce it. We want to get the right behavior, but that behavior is in effect costly. Now, what I've observed over the decades of my involvement in this work, and maybe some of you have also seen this, is that the word accomplishments has been used in different ways by different people. And sometimes people seem to be referring to what I would call business results or organizational results, things like revenue or profit or market share. Now, I do not view that as what we really mean by accomplishments, but since I don't want to argue with people, we coined the term work outputs about 15 years ago or maybe 20 years ago. And so we think that phrase works pretty well because two parts. One is clearly we're talking about the product of work. So that would be individuals or possibly processes or teams, but the product of human activity typically. And then outputs, notice that it's plural. So these are things that can be counted. And that's a big deal because it's not only important in terms of defining the valuable contributions that people, processes, and teams make, but it's also valuable for measurement. Now, this led us to our first model because if there's any contribution that I and my colleagues have made over the last 35 years, I think it's taking decades of performance improvement, human performance technology, et cetera, and boiling it down or distilling it to what I think are its essentials that really don't miss anything, that everything can be incorporated. And it's really two models, the first of which we call the performance chain. So, first of all, business results. If you click, you see we always want to be sure we know what's at stake for the organization. And then the next thing, sort of working backwards, is what we call work outputs, as we mentioned. And those are the things that people produce. And what's important about that is notice the words below it. There's a lot of different kinds of work outputs. Some of them are very concrete deliverables, widgets, documents, et cetera. But there's things like decisions, milestones, relationships, et cetera, which are less tangible, but they are nonetheless countable things of value. So we always want to be sure people know about those. And then working backwards, of course, there's the behavior needed to produce them. And what's beautiful about this way of thinking is that once you know what the behavior, what you're supposed to produce, what the valuable thing is, it's not that hard to figure out the behavior because you can do a task analysis, you can observe successful performers, but you can observe exemplary performers, but you can figure out in detail what the behavior is. And then finally, and this is not part of performance, this is what influenced performance. We coined the term behavior influences to refer to all of the things that either exist or we put in place that either ideally support the behavior to produce the work outputs to contribute to business results, or that get in the way. And so once we have a definition of that, we can basically look at the whole system. Now it works obviously from left to right, but we analyze it from right to left. So that's the first model. That's how we define and sort of pull about performance. If we go to the next slide, we go to Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, which you can unpack. People are familiar with this probably. I learned this also from Tom, as did probably tens of thousands of other people. And it started with Skinner's framework at the very top there, discriminative stimuli setting the occasion for responses that hopefully lead to reinforcing stimuli. And then someone sort of plain English this a few years later to antecedents, behavior, and consequences. But what Tom Gilbert offered, and I think it was brilliant, was the recognition that we humans are individuals. And so we often have, you can have environmental factors that influence behavior, but then you have to look at the individuals. And so he divided these things into those the environment and the person. So on the top row, there's data, as he described it, basically information that sets the expectations and helps us know how we're doing. What he called instruments, which were all the things that you use while you're performing to support that. Incentives, which is his way of talking about consequences. And then the person requires knowledge or skills, a repertoire, and we either give it to them through training and development, or they already have that. And then capacity is the individual's fit for the job, basically. And then motives are both a way of talking about whether the incentives are actually motivating to this person, So at a narrow level, being sure that they're functionally defined as what behaviorists would call reinforcers, but also more broadly, the values of the organization and do they line up with my personal values and so forth. So this was a brilliant model, as everybody who's on this webinar surely knows. But what we recognized when we started showing it to people was that there was a lot of confusion about some of the language. So I spent probably 4 or 5 years in the mid 80s tweaking the language until we came up with this plain language description or labels for each of the cells. And what we did is we user tested it until we got to the point where virtually nobody, once it was introduced, would make category errors. They understood what worked in these cells. And also you could use these words with people and they didn't even know you were using a language. It just made sense to them. People knew what expectations and feedback were. So this is the way we framed the behavior influences. And if you go to the next slide, what you recognize, I just throw this in because even though it was a small number, I always think it's worth mentioning. A few years ago, one of our colleagues who, let's see if he's here with us. He's not, I don't think, but ran a session at the International Society for Performance Improvement, in which they nominated and then voted for the best performance model in the world. And guess what? The 6 boxes won. Now, it's a small number, but I like to share this because I think it reflects the fact that people find this useful and practical. But let's click to the next slide and see how we use this. If we take the 6 boxes and use that as the way to organize behavior influences, we can then click to the next thing, which is what we call performance improvement logic. And you can just click through these, but if we're doing any kind of project, whether it's a formal big project like Cindy's going to talk about, or whether it's an ad hoc thing that comes up in a meeting, the logic of this that we recognize that you can apply really to anything is you start out with business results. You want to know what's at stake for this project, this intervention, this problem. You then go to the second thing, which is what are the work outputs? And are we sure they contribute to business results? Because they may or may not. If they don't, we may not even want to keep them around, but we want to be sure there's a relationship there. And then we go to the third step, which is that through task analysis, observing, and so forth, we figure out the behavior to produce those work outputs. And then the fourth step is those are the things you can measure. So we can measure business results, but those will be lagging indicators and we can't make many decisions about them. We can measure behavior, but it's expensive. You got to watch people in most cases, and that's a costly thing to do. But if we focus on work outputs as a measurement, often we can count them and we can have a relatively straightforward way to monitor performance without it being as expensive as it would be if we were looking at behavior, and yet still have leading indicators. Once we've figured out what we think we're going to measure, then we go to the behavior influences and we do a little design thinking. We analyze what's working or what's not working in each of the cells or what's missing, the pluses and minuses and the just absence of behavior influences in some of the categories. We then, usually with our stakeholders or whoever we're working with, brainstorm possible improvements with a kind of a green light point of view, which is like, what are the possible things we could do here? And then we choose them, again, ideally with the stakeholders, which leads to whatever the design or the intervention. And then we implement and we measure and we change as needed. And then one of the powers of this framework with its 2 pictures and 21 plain English words is that we can pretty immediately start sharing the language and the way of thinking with people and draw them in so we can collaborate. So that's kind of performance thinking. Now, I think there's one more slide here, which kind of is an effort to crystallize why we think this is a good approach to performance improvement. One is, as did Gilbert and Joe Harless, it focuses on value delivered, the work outputs that are valuable to the extent that they contribute to business or organizational results. The performance chain gives us what a behavior scientist would call units of analysis, business results, outputs, and behavior. The plain English makes it easy to communicate and collaborate with people fairly quickly rather than sort of complex, models with a lot of jargon. I think, and a lot of our colleagues think, and I think many of you in this group here that I'm looking at, I think, that this does distill performance improvement into really its essentials, but it does it in a way that's not overwhelming. It's two pictures and, as we say, 21 plain English words. And finally, people want to have a systemic view. If you're really doing performance improvement, you want to look at all the factors. And the six boxes model actually is systemic because it's not just for the individual performer. You can have expectations set by, federal policy if you want. You can have feedback or tools and resources or whatever at any level in the system, including things that are even outside your organization. So the beauty of the six boxes is that a complete framework for all the things in the system that ought to work together. So that's the model. So now I just want to let Cindy introduce herself, tell you a little bit about herself and her work, and then tell you about the project.
Thank you very much. Okay.
We're good?
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, everybody. My name is Cindy Thompson, and I have a varied background, as you can see. I actually ended up meeting Carl. I read Tom Gilbert's book at one point. I reached out to Carl on LinkedIn and asked him a few questions, which he may or may not remember. And then the world brought us together, and I took the performance thinking program last summer. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, where I came from. I have a different type of background experience. I actually am a systems engineer, and I started working back in, over 20 years ago. And I've got the space station up there because one of the programs that I worked on, I helped debug a piece of hardware that was on the space station. It actually was controlling the toilet, and so my kids love the fact that I helped to debug the toilet on the space station. Then I changed companies. I ended up working on a huge helicopter program. So I was a system engineer working with 400 people on a helicopter program. And why I bring this up, because I, at that point, had a very traditional view of behavior of people. I was a leader at one point, and I can remember thinking, why aren't people doing what they're supposed to do? What you need to do, just do it, right? Typical person. Now, what happened through different life experiences, I went back to school and did a master's in applied behavior analysis. So I specialized in behavioral science. That opened up a world for me of getting people understanding why people do things, understanding the barriers, and having a roadmap as to how can I remove barriers in order to create an environment that results in the behaviors that we want for people. So now I am working at a Crown Corporation here in Canada, and I am helping to integrate new processes enterprise-wide. The project I'm going to share with you today is one that I did internally to my team, but I also work on enterprise-wide processes where I have to work with multiple stakeholders, dealing with different constraints of their time, their resources. And so it seems as if my life has culminated into helping people be able to work more efficiently, effectively, and helping teams be generally happier and work well. So the project that I did through Carl's program was to look for opportunities to improve the quality of data that we have in our database, our customer database. I won't go into huge detail, but what we do is we have customers that need our products and services. And being a government, we need to make sure that we follow very strict rules and guidelines when it comes to knowing who we're dealing with and making sure that we are not, say, lending money or supporting any organizations that we really don't want to be supporting. The team I'm working on is responsible for going and looking for that company information. So, for example, making sure we know who the company, the legal name is. We need to go into different registries to confirm that. Do they have any trade names, their phone number, their address? So just as you would have to show your driver's license or other government identification if you're going to the bank and you want a loan. We need to do the same, except we are not asking customers. Our analysts have to go out into the world and find that information. And as you can imagine, lots of people trying to gather lots of information, it can be hard to get good quality data. And here, quality means consistent based on our rules. So what did I do? I did two main things. I did a documentation review. I looked at the job aids, our processes, the audit results that we had internally. I talked with a lot of people. I talked with about 8 analysts, the auditor on the team, the leaders on the team, and I used Copilot to help me group all of those interviews together. I recorded them, transcribed them. I had a set list of questions based on Carl's program of what I wanted to ask people, and then I used AI to help me do the analysis. But as I was going through, Carl would have us go through and look at what are the business results, customer retention, customer satisfaction. We had a bunch more internally, but I think these can speak to what many people are needing these days. Then came the work outputs, which was the trickiest and hardest part, and yet the most valuable part of the project. It was looking at the valuable accomplishments that were adding, matching up to the business results. So a completed company record, but then every attribute ended up being its own work output. And I would dive in, we'll look in a moment, but I dove into different attributes to find out what was influencing an analyst's ability to get consistent data. So if you have 2 or 3 analysts, you want to make sure they all come to the same conclusion. What were some of the barriers and opportunities? From a behavioral point of view, behaviors, they have to go through each registry, and there could be multiple. Some of them are Canadian, US, international. Some of them are in different languages. They have to make decisions, and I think one of the work output are decisions. They need to decide on the best quality information. They need to enter the data into the system appropriately. So I worked backwards. So you saw Carl's chain go left to right. I started on the right side and worked backwards. Now, really the crux of this project came to looking at the behavioral influences. I've got some here on the screen. I won't go through all of them, but what I will say is the questions that Carl helped guide us in asking in the projects really helped to draw out people's the barriers that people were facing, to look beyond the individual, because as I learned in behavioral science courses, the environment really influences the person more than the individual themselves in many cases, and found that there were lots of things that were potential opportunities to improve, whether it was the frequency of feedback. The feedback that was given tended to be quarterly. So we do know that the more immediate feedback will have the greatest impact on changing behavior. And so what we found was quarterly feedback may not be enough to get people up to the level that they need to be, and more frequent feedback was needed. Job aids are very well defined, but what's happened with this team is their scope has grown, not quite exponentially, but pretty close, and they're incredibly dedicated people who are having to do more and more and more work. So then the question is, how can we support folks in learning all of the new things that need to be learned? And I guess one thing else that I'll bring up is, from a consequences point of view, when we go to the the recommendations. That middle part, the decision criteria, became the key item in the process. So when I had mapped out the process, I looked at each phase, I looked at the behaviors and the outputs for the whole process, and realized that the area that was most tricky for people were, for example, when you have trade names, how that differed. Legal name, companies have one legal name, but companies can have many trade names. So how do you know as an analyst, when do you stop looking? When do you stop trying to find more and say, this is enough? So through the analysis, I was able to identify areas in the process that were generally working well, and then areas that really required the deep dive. And that's where I paid the most attention to. Now, what we did, I did recommend increasing the feedback, and the feedback got increased to monthly, which is great. And oddly enough, most people actually preferred getting more frequent feedback, which was really interesting. One thing we looked at is fit for purpose. So looking at each field, because the scope and the demands of the team have increased so much. And the question was, is there anything we can take off their plate? And does the business still need a fax number, for example, right? Things that were good 10, 15 years ago may no longer be relevant. People now have mobile phones. They don't have fax numbers. So it's really looking at, why are we doing what we're doing? And can we stop doing some of those? And then with the job aids, it was evaluating to see, is there any way we can just make them easier and more streamlined, because there are so many of them. And so just before we kick it back to you there, Carl, some of my key takeaways, and this was a very high level summary, but I love the Deming quote that a bad system will beat a good person every time. The pre-behavioral scientist of me would have really looked at the individual. Why is that person, like, what is the fault with them? And I don't think this, but are they lazy, not working hard enough? Like, that was the younger me. The more evolved me now thinks, well, what's going on? So that person is choosing certain behaviors, which is resulting in a work output that we may or may not like. And so really assume good intent. And I'm sure everyone on here is going to be aligned with that. People just want to do a good job. And given the right tools and the right environment, that's what they want to do. So if they aren't meeting the expectation, then we need to look externally to the individual first. When you're doing your analysis, start with the big picture. I knew the end-to-end process, but because I knew the end-to-end process, I could understand what optimizing one part of the process would do to the whole. Oftentimes, I think people have a bit of a tunnel vision to say, we'll fix this one thing that is broken here. Having that big picture will allow you to increase your probability of success. Third takeaway, environment definitely is where the greatest opportunities often reside, and they tend to be the ones that people aren't as aware of. And finally, and I think, Carl, you mentioned many people on here have gone through your course. We all know the performance thinking approach really helps to provide a framework to do a holistic and systemic review of the processes or the challenges. And what I found great about this is it helped me to facilitate discussions with the team, because the language is clear, it makes sense, and people can follow it. So all in all, it was a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Well, that's a nice thing to hear, that it was a wonderful experience. I'm not sure if everybody in this list would agree, because I can be a nitpicker, but thank you. Thank you, Cindy.
You're
Um,
welcome.
so I wonder so I'm not sure how people are seeing us, but I've got us both up here. So Couple of things. First of all, I think the recent moonshot needs you because they were having problems with their toilet as well. So you, you might.
We joked about that at home.
I didn't know that part of your thing. So Erwin, we're gonna talk, have a little bit of an exchange between us. But what's your question? What's up? What are you thinking?
I actually have two questions. The first one is, I can't start my video, but anyway, the first
That's
question
okay.
is, when you were in engineering training, what did you learn about managing people that you later learned was not right?
Um, I can't think that we learned anything about managing people in engineering. And I don't know if that's the answer you were expecting, but both in engineering and even honestly in my behavior analytic master's, uh, the focus is different. And the reality is accomplishments happen because people make them happen. And one of my goals is to really help organizations understand that by applying a different frame of mind and a different analysis and looking outside the individual, there are so many problems that can be avoided. So I wish I had this kind of training. I've actually thought of going back to my university and offering to speak with the engineering classes because I think this would be a great eye opener for them.
That's a great
The
one.
second
Yeah.
question is, have you tried explaining this to other engineers and how did they react if you did?
Um, Not other engineers, however, my children, yes. And um, honestly, one of the challenges is in a master's program, you're very technical, you are very much in the science, and you use a lot of jargon. And when I'm working with non-behavior analytic people, I didn't know how to speak in a way that they would understand. And this is where this project really helped me explore ways of having these discussions with people that doesn't sound sciencey. It makes sense, and yet it's still very much rooted in the science of behavior.
That's great.
Thanks, Cindy.
It's great
You're
to hear.
welcome.
Well, let me ask a couple of or make a couple comments also before we also have some more questions from the audience. One is, you mentioned when you talked about business results, you mentioned customer satisfaction and retention, but I
Mhm.
also had the sense that there's potential risks. Like you mentioned, we don't want to be giving money to people we shouldn't be, and so forth. So I
Right.
would think there would be some other sort of organizational results that are, I don't know what they'd be called, but like safety or risk management or something like that.
Mhm.
So did you explicitly talk about or identify kind of those kind of, you definitely don't want to have a high level of whatever this is, that kind of thing, risk business
I
results, if you will.
I did. It wasn't the key part of my project, but
Mhm.
one of the things, for example, we are not quite a financial institution, but we do lend money out. We are a crown corporation, which is an arm of the government. We do not want to finance financial crimes. We do not want to. Um, we need to make sure that every transaction we do fits our mandate.
Mhm.
And so our team is actually part of the first line of defense to make sure
Mhm.
that we know who we're interacting with and who we're
Mhm.
doing business with.
Right. That makes sense.
Now, how it did influence or inform the decisions is when we are looking at each field, knowing how the business uses that field, and are they using it for legal purposes? Are they
Mhm.
using it for screening purposes, for risk screening, or are they
Mhm.
not using it at all? So those are the parts where understanding how the business uses not the data as a whole, but the data as a
Mhm.
part,
Mhm.
really will inform our decisions on how much rigor that we put into ensuring quality.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, there's a couple thoughts I have about that. One is one of the things that we teach people when we can about this performance thinking thing is to try to get the vocabulary of your, especially senior leaders in an organization, about what the business results are. And so part of it is I was curious about that. But I'm also thinking, as you're just speaking, the decisions were also outputs in this, right? That's a big part of it, in fact. And so I would bet the kinds of decisions that have to be made, part of it is about, I mean, what you were talking about is decisions for how deep I need to go to get trade names, for example, is your example.
Right.
But I'm thinking that people also are making decisions once the data are in there. And those seem like where you could look for the risk kind of situations. Because if this information is not correct, could we make a mistake and fund or otherwise, support something we shouldn't, that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. Yes. The data that we do collect do feed those downstream risk assessment
Yeah.
processes and legal processes, and they support business development.
Mhm.
They support the whole business. One thing that is interesting is if I can maybe bring AI in here for a little bit, right? Thinking about how does the business use each element, each data element,
Mhm.
also will inform in the future, how do we, what is the criteria for good
Yeah.
based on the purpose that the data will be used for. For
Yes.
example, and I'll use this one, Carl. I'm sure that if you are doing business with a company and they're
Mhm.
going to have to pay you money, you want to make sure they are a real company. So you'll do a little bit more due diligence.
Yes, this is true.
Now, if people are signing up for a webinar, the quality of that data or the accuracy of that data doesn't necessarily need to be quite so high.
Mhm.
And so this looking at data through that lens will allow us to apply a bit of AI of can we use some kind of agent to go and verify, webinar attendee data versus having the person in the loop and the analyst who are verifying real company customer data.
Mhm.
So the future is going to be interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Well, what I was also thinking, based on what you said, is decisions, when we talk about outputs, as you said, we define criteria for a good one. And when
Mhm.
you think about decisions as an output, the criteria for a good one are also usually the factors on which the decision is made, right?
Yes.
They determine the decision in that sense. And so I was beginning to understand something I've never thought about before, which is that the organizational or business results in any given hunk of performance may be several clicks away. Actually, it may be, oh, well, the
Mm.
output is this. And, and so the business concerns are, let's say the decision, like what can go wrong or what's the upside of this decision. And the criteria, and then the other piece of that is that we often say in a process, or in any case, you mentioned the users of the data. I think I don't remember what word you used, but we look at the needs of the recipient of the output, and that determines a lot of the criteria. And so it's interesting because to me, what you're describing is a more robust understanding of the implications of deciding what a good one is. In this case, a good decision of various kinds.
Exactly, which ties to the comment I had made that by understanding the end to end, you can
Hmm.
optimize a part of
Yeah,
it. And
absolutely.
really, and Sarah, in the comments, you talked about preventing tunnel vision. I think that is the key, is you don't know how something is going, how a change will impact downstream unless
Yeah.
you know the downstream and the upstream as well.
Mhm. Yeah. So let's see. Is there? Oh, one other thing I was going to ask, and then let's see what people say. Alex has a good thumbs up there. I was going to ask, to what detail in this project did you need to get into the sort of best practices behavior for doing that? I mean, the decisions would be part of it. You were talking about how deep I need to go. Do I need to keep looking for trade names or DBAs or whatever? But I'm wondering in general, did you speak with or have an opportunity to talk to, successful or exemplary performers are there any tricks, I guess is one way to think about it. We talk about exemplary behavior. We say, well, this is something that this person who's an extraordinary performer does that really makes a difference in something. And I wondered if there was any of that in this project.
It's so funny you bring that up. I interviewed, I think it was about 8 analysts of varying tenure and varying experience, and everybody had tricks and that other people didn't really know about, right? So the best practices that they have developed over the years,
Mm-hmm.
like making a checklist. They had a checklist, for example, one person did. And they don't realize how important that one little special behavior that they do
Yeah.
is and how it can help other people.
Yeah.
So our team did start doing, um, I guess, group a group record creation every now
Mm-hmm.
and then to try
Mm-hmm.
and show those tips and tricks that people have, because they don't necessarily make a difference in the final decision, but sometimes it can help in the speed, or it
Yeah,
can help
exactly.
in the keeping on top of it. So, or it can help with their fluency, or there's so
Mm-hmm.
many different things that here I was focused on like looking for opportunities for good quality, but what do you define as quality, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good one. Well, it's interesting because sort of the school book thing about exemplary behavior is if you've got an exceptional performer, a real star who's far more productive, might be more fluent, maybe takes less time, whatever, then you look at their behavior. Sometimes they don't even know they're doing it. Sometimes it's unconscious competence. But to me, the part of continuous improvement has always been once you lay down a foundation of the outputs and the behavior
Mhm.
and the criteria, and then you begin to discover whether it's through a kind of a group process you were talking about, or whether it's seeing, wait a minute, Jack, how come Jack always finishes more than everybody else? And then you go watch Jack, and
Mhm.
maybe Jack didn't even know he was doing this, but you can extract that and incorporate that into what other people are doing. And the concept is you can then raise everybody's average. So that's cool that you were able to do that. Is that an ongoing, do you anticipate that being something carried forward, that periodically people check in to see if they've discovered any new tricks or not? I'm just curious about that.
It is actually part of our weekly meetings where there's a tips and tricks
Cool.
section.
Yeah.
It's a set agenda, and people do bring things forward. Sometimes it isn't even exactly work related. It's more, hey, you could use Copilot in this way to
Hmm.
make this easier. And sometimes it's,
Hmm.
oh, did you know that for this field, there's this new registry or this new document
Right.
that people can look at. And I think it's that continuous learning mindset and being curious about how you can improve individually and as a team. So yeah, it
Yeah,
definitely
that's
is.
cool. Yeah, because I always say when we're laying out the logic, I always say you define whatever your intervention's going to be, you then measure it because you never get it 100% right, and so
No.
then you discover some opportunities. But what you even are talking about is beyond that. You get updates, you get a new resource that wasn't available when you first designed this thing, and so you're doing continuous improvement. But it's all laid down on this kind of foundation of defining the performance, which is really cool. So maybe we should see what if there are any comments or questions from some other folks. Raise their hands or anybody. Erwin had a good couple of them. Any other people have thoughts, comments, questions?
Hi, Carl, this is Roger.
Hi, Roger. Nice to see you or hear you.
Um, I was wondering when you were doing your using Carl's model, which is a great model. Actually, all those models are great. Did you use any other models that influenced your thinking as well?
Hmm.
Isn't this?
Great question,
You mentioned Deming.
Roger.
You quoted Deming as one of your quotes that you made. So I'm just curious.
I did. I am definitely interested in behavioral systems analysis and Rumler and Brosh. I never get that second, but the Managing the White Space book is one that I've used. So looking at a relationship map and then going, so the organization level, the process level, and the task level, that was in my mind as well as I was doing the project.
Good. Just curious. Yesterday was Gary Rumler's birthday.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
All
Happy
right.
belated
Oh,
birthday.
I wish I'd known that. That's the 16th, April 16th. Okay. Well, it's funny because that quote from Deming, Geary said it almost exactly the same thing later, and maybe he got it from, maybe you know this, Roger, I don't know, but Geary used to say, you put a good a person against a bad system and the system will win every time. So he probably learned that from Deming, since Deming was a little bit older than he, I think, but I'm not sure. Anyway,
Mhm.
any other questions or comments or observations? There's Kathleen Donahue. Oh, just showed up for a moment. From Shelley Smith is a thank you.
Yeah.
So I wonder, just given that we've been talking about this for a few minutes, Cindy, if there's any additional stuff that you would add, although here's a chat thing. I don't know what's in it. Let's see. Maybe you can even read that better than I can. There's a thank you, I guess. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, one of the things to me, and Roger's question was quite relevant to me, is when I look at your background, I mean, you've got layers of sort of engineering thinking. And of course, this stuff is really performance engineering, human performance engineering. And so I was really going to be fascinated to hear what you would say when you said other influences, because when I look at your history, it's like, oh, there's layers of building this analytical thinking in your history. But I'm just wondering if you have any other comments or observations, given that, at least at the moment, we don't see other hands were being raised.
I mean, one thing I have struggled. So I finished my master's, in 2020? It was, yeah, COVID had just started. And I absolutely love the science, right? Like when I say I fell in love with the science, I never loved the science of engineering, even, but I love the science of behavior because it is so powerful and it can bring so much good to the world. And I always struggled to try to figure out how to speak with people. And Erwin, your question hit the mark, right? How do you speak with people who don't have your background and do it in a way that they get it and that you can influence change? And one of the things that I have done is, since I finished the course, I find myself using work outputs more and more. Whenever I define a project and I have to define chunks of work for it, I'm thinking, what are the work outputs from that phase, from that, we use Agile, so from that feature, right? What will the work output look like? When I'm re-engineering processes, especially whenever work is changing teams, I look at those handoff points and I think, because that's where things can fall apart, is the handoffs between swim lanes in a process. And I think, what is the work output? What will the trigger be for the next person down the chain to be able to pick up the work and move forward? And what is the criteria for good in that work output? So what data do they need? What information do they need? And so I haven't done the whole chain analysis for everything I do, but I have used my knowledge of the business results. I have used work outputs more and more, and I've really focused in on those handoffs, so that white space between swim lanes. It's a different way of thinking. Being a trained behavior analyst, you're trained to observe behavior, so the switch to work outputs was a bit tricky. There's value, though, because what you mentioned earlier, you can't always be there to observe behavior, especially in a work environment. It's different than when you're working with learners one-on-one. You get to observe their behavior. I've been able to use this in some way, shape, or form since I've finished the project, which is great.
Yeah, that's I think really important. Several things you said. One is the handoffs. That's where things break down, right? And if in a certain way, Gary Rumler's thing about the white space, managing the white space in the organizational chart is across, and that's where the handoffs happen. And in contrast, you got silos, and so that's where the criteria are especially important. And everything you said. And I think we were having a conversation last week about this or something. And that's a big deal. It's within a process. If you're doing a series of things yourself, or even just your little team and there's several people, that's one thing. But when you send it to the other department, man, you better be sure that you're giving them what they need, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really interesting. The other thing to me is, of the work that I've done, people love the 6 boxes model. And I think the 6 boxes model is wonderful. It takes what a brilliant thing was from Tom Gilbert, the behavior engineering model, and makes it a little more accessible to people. So it's fantastic. People love it, blah, blah, blah. But to me, the big contribution is this focus on accomplishments. And I still, whatever it is, 30 years later, am discovering the benefits of that still. Like, it takes you to the behavior in a way that if you didn't have it, you wouldn't be able to necessarily figure out the behavior. There's so many things about this accomplishment-based thing that makes a big difference. So I wish people wouldn't get as excited about the 6 boxes and they'd get more excited about accomplishments. I guess is what I'm trying to say. Any other comments from people or questions? Because we're just about at an hour and we can probably stop, but I'll be sure we've addressed.
Yes,
this is great. Go ahead.
Yeah, real quick. I know it's 3:57. Well, at least in Florida. How are everybody? My name is Roberto. I just wanted to say, really good presentation, very organized, Cindy. And real quick, I really like the part that you mentioned, frequent feedback. And I wanted to add that not only frequent, but the structure of that feedback, because feedback is so important that can literally, well, not literally, but you can pull people down or push them away with one word, or actually lift them up. So I think that was spot on. I think that's a small detail that some people maybe overlook sometimes, but just to be aware, feedback is an extremely powerful tool.
Yeah.
I met you, Carl Binder, in the last ISBI. I was one of the students that competed with the university case study, and I had a picture with you. So, yeah, so.
That's right. I remember that.
Yeah.
Well, building on that comment, I talk about feedbacks. I let people do plural of that as outputs. They're an output of whoever it is giving the feedback. And what you described just now is the best description I've heard about that, because what I always say is, okay, it's behavior when I'm giving you feedback. However, the words you choose, the content of the feedback, whether it's spoken or written, can make an enormous impact. And you just gave a great example of that. So we can talk about a good feedback or not so good of a feedback, and it's genuinely an output. So thank you for that comment. I just learned something. I always learn stuff from these
Carl,
things.
this is
Yes.
Roger. I think read the work of Don Toasty on feedback is very, very helpful.
Yeah, that's true.
Delivering it and at the right time, so it's timing also. So I encourage people that read Don Toasty's work.
Yeah, good suggestion. That's the big one. All right, everyone. Well, I think we're probably at the end of the hour. So thank you, Cindy. This is I thought this would be fun, and I learned a lot from just having the conversation and preparing and also listening to you today. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for showing up. This is a fun group, and we'll take this and probably clean it up a little bit as a video, and then we'll put it on performancethinking.tv in the next few days if you want to share it with people or look at it again. So thank you.
Thank you, Carl, for this opportunity, and thank you everyone for showing up.